He's the Associate Director of Food Safety and Regulatory Affairs at Kraft Heinz with over 25 years of experience, focusing on the control of foodborne pathogens in manufacturing environments, rapid detection and genetic characterization methods, and continuous improvement of food safety systems such as HACCP. Mickey Parrish had another commitment tonight that prevented him from joining us, but agreeing to come in his stead and representing the regulatory perspective is Leslie Hintz. Leslie is a compliance officer at FDA's Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. Leslie has many years of experience in compliance and is very knowledgeable about the FDA use of whole genome sequencing for regulatory enforcement. Next up, representing the legal perspective, is Sean Stevens. Sean is the founder of the Food Industry Council, which provides consultation and legal services to clients both domestic and abroad, across a range of areas including brand protection by reducing food safety risk, achieving regulatory compliance, managing recall, and providing legal defense for foodborne illness claimants. Our fourth panelist who will be providing perspective from the academic side is Dr. Renato Orsi. Dr. Orsi is a Senior Research Associate at the Food Safety Laboratory in the Department of Food Science at Cornell University. I think that's the longest title. His research focuses on the use of whole genome sequencing for source tracking of foodborne pathogens throughout food processing, and also in exploring specific genetic features of pathogen strains that are associated with persistence in food processing environments. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our panelists. Okay, so first question is for Renato. Renato, and we covered this in the survey, so those of you that got 3 for 3, this probably isn't going to be as interesting to you. But there seems to be a lot of conflation in terms with next-gen sequencing and whole genome sequencing and high-throughput sequencing. Can you tell us, in very simple terms, what is the difference between when we say next-gen sequencing and whole genome sequencing? What's the difference?
Sure. Hello. So next generation sequencing, NGS, that's a generic name that we give to several instruments that are used to sequencing DNA. And they are different from cellular sequencing, which is the predecessor of this next generation sequencing. And they use different chemistries. So actually what we call next generation sequencing are actually a variety of instruments that use different chemistry to sequence DNA, and they have different throughputs and different advantages and disadvantages. And WGS, or whole genome sequencing, is one of the things that you can do with the next generation sequencing machines. So the other things would be metagenomics, for example, and RNA sequencing. So whole genome sequencing is when you sequence the whole genome of an organism, at least in theory, a whole genome.
So whole genome sequencing is an application under the next-gen sequencing umbrella, which covers a broader band of
right. It's one of the applications for next-generation sequencing, but there are many more applications for that technology.
Okay, and then follow up to that. So we've been doing strain typing for a long time, right? I mean, serology was one of the original forms of differentiating between strains of different species. So we've been doing strain typing for a long time, and it's had an evolution all its own, from serology to pulse field gel electrophoresis, other types of intermediate strain typing technologies, and now whole genome sequencing. Why are we changing again? Why not PFGE and rep PCR and ribose printing? Why don't we stay with those?
Right. So each of these methods that we are replacing by new methods, they have lower discriminatory power than the new methods that are replacing them. So we are always trying to increase our discriminatory power to better differentiate the isolates and assess whether two different isolates are actually representing the same strain or not. And whole genome sequencing is a method that you can differentiate isolates based on their whole genome. So, for example, the circumcytogenes has 3 million nucleotides in the chromosome. So you can look at all 3 million nucleotides in the distributed cytogenous genome and see how many differences are along those 3 million nucleotides. And the other methods, they investigate just like a limited portion of the genomes. And that's why whole genome sequencing has a much better resolution and discriminatory power than these previous techniques.
Is this better?
Oh, yeah.
Great. Do we have an estimate on what the difference is in the powers of the differentiation between, say, PFGE and whole genome sequencing, like a number for that?
It varies greatly from pathogen to pathogen, like if we're talking about foodborne pathogens. For example, for Salmonella enteritidis, if I'm not mistaken, about half, 50% of the isolates cannot be differentiated by PFG. If you go to MLVA, which is multilocus variable tandem repeats, then you can get a differentiate of maybe like 60 to 70% of the isolates. And with whole genome sequencing, you can pretty much differentiate all the isolates. So, I mean, just one example, but it varies from pathogen, from organism to organism. Even like different serotypes of Salmonella, they have different discriminatory powers with each of the techniques.
That makes sense. Thank you, Bernardo. So Leslie, can you tell us about the factors behind the decision by CDC and FDA to transition from PFGE PulseNet to genome tracker and whole genome sequencing?
Sure. From the FDA perspective, we are a regulatory agency, so our focus is to ensure public health and to make sure that there's a safe food supply that doesn't have contamination or has a very low risk of contamination to consumers. So that being said, our focus for switching and for primarily focusing on whole genome sequencing is speed and accuracy. We have had a lot of success using whole genome sequencing. It's a very strong signal device for FDA. We're able to better detect if the same strain of bacteria may be found in a production environment over time, if that strain of bacteria has caused illness, or if there's a transient strain that we've detected over time versus the resident type discussion. So for FDA, it really is all about speed and accuracy. And so we use whole genome sequencing to focus on foodborne investigations and during our normal inspection and sampling techniques as well.
Okay, thank you. And then could you summarize for us in just a few sentences, if possible, what the role of whole genome sequencing and gene tracker is currently playing in driving enforcement policy within the FDA? How is it being used? What's the application side of this with enforcement?
Sure. I mean, it still is, it's a signaling device for FDA. It is the same sort of policy discussions that we had previously with PFGE or with other, pathogen detection technologies that are out there. So FDA is using it as sort of a replacement technology for PFGE, but it's really just a signaling device. It's something that gives FDA a greater power in kind of our knowledge and sort of the history of the foodborne pathogens in a particular product or in a particular production environment over time.
So again, the reason to move from PFGE to whole genome sequencing, was it just a confidence thing? It just increases the confidence in the level that you have with the data that's being generated and the decisions that arise from that data?
Sure. A common analogy that we use kind of in FDA when we're describing this, because we've had to describe this to other people in our agency as well, is that it's kind of like looking at space through the Hubble, right? It's a better signaling device versus looking at space through a standard telescope. You're still looking at space, you just have a greater resolution of what you're able to see at a particular time.
Okay, and can you talk to us about how, Genome Tracker uses whole genome sequencing for different things, everything from tracking an outbreak when someone's been sick and you're going backwards, to when there's the on-site FDA swabathons, they take that data and then they use it to determine whether or not there's a persistent issue, especially over time. So can you describe for us a little bit on how the FDA might treat those things differently, if at all? The difference between repeated environmental findings over time using genome tracker versus an outbreak situation where you're going backwards and trying to determine source?
Sure. I mean, the classic FDA answer, and I think a classic microbiologist answer, is that all of these situations depend, right? How we're looking at, if we use whole genome sequencing and we unfortunately isolate Listeria monocytogenes out of a ready-to-eat food product, FDA is then going to compare that isolate and that strain of Listeria monocytogenes in that food product into the larger whole genome sequencing database, the genome tracker database that we're calling it, to see if that strain has been isolated somewhere else. If that strain had been isolated during environmental sampling at that production environment, if that strain had been isolated, from unfortunately, like a clinical illness that our state and local partners in conjunction with CDC work to upload. So FDA is using it, for environmental sampling. I believe we coined the term swabathon ourselves. So we use it for any Listeria monocytogenes isolate that we have, and for any Salmonella isolate that we have collected as well. We're comparing it over time to see if there's possibly a resident strain in that facility. We're comparing it to see if that strain is found somewhere else. And the enforcement strategies, or the next conversation is still sort of the same type of conversation that would have happened with PFGE. We're just able to give a greater resolution and a greater signal with whole genome sequencing technology than we were previously.
Thank you, Leslie. Excellent answers. This will be the last one, then I'll give you a break for a little bit. Are regulatory groups working on putting together some sort of official policy document regarding whole genome? I guess no secret that the food industry is somewhat left in the lurch on exactly how this technology is being used, what sort of implications the data would have, how it's going to be interpreted. I think there also may be an impression that on the regulatory side, you're kind of playing it by ear. Like as the data comes in and you're making decisions based on a larger pool of data outside of whole genome sequencing. And so I think that some of the confusion, some of the misunderstanding on genome tracker specifically, regulatory use of whole genome sequencing, may be due to lack of a publicly facing official policy document. Is that something that's being worked on?
Sure, and that's a question that we've gotten a couple times. And just to kind of reemphasize that, the policy for how FDA is viewing foodborne pathogens in both a production environment or in a product is still the same policy that we've had, with PFGE or with other isolation technologies. So it's definitely something that our administration is taking a look at, and our senior regulatory officials are, kind of determining if we need, or kind of the next steps about if a document may be needed and what that might look like. There is a working group now with the three main kind of government agencies, FDA, USDA, and CDC. We're all kind of combining to come up with a couple publications on how the industry, or how the government is kind of taking a look at these technologies, and some case studies involved in all of that. So as far as like an official compliance policy guide or official policy document, to the best of my knowledge, that's still being discussed, but one hasn't been officially decided on yet.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. Sean, do you agree with the FDA's Hissan whole genome sequencing-based determinations and actions that you've seen so far?
Yeah, the use of whole genome sequencing, in my view, has enabled the agency and really the industry, right? Because it's either happening to us or we're watching it, but has enabled the agency to kind of walk into a basement where the lights have always been off, right? And turn them on. And suddenly we can see, right, for the first time ever because of the high resolution, associations, right, between products and people, between people and other people, and begin to solve, right, puzzles of outbreaks that have been occurring that in the past we just didn't have the capability to see. So in, I think, each of the instances I'm aware of, where whole genome sequencing played a role in helping identify an outbreak, yeah, CDC and FDA, they got it right. But what we're also learning is that I guess the form, right, of the outbreak or the recall is different now, the model. The whole genome sequencing, because of this additional visibility, is enabling us to really understand the larger, I guess, persistence of bacteria in food facilities. And every recall, every outbreak that I'm reading about now involves large amounts of product produced over large periods of time that's intermittently contaminated, right? And that's the capability to enable the agency to do it. So, the science is real. And so, yes, I do agree.
Very good. And then, so far, I think most of the focus has been on that. Something bad has happened. And on the regulatory side, they use data that's generated from that to go back to and trace out the source, and then, somebody gets, fined or put in jail, bad stuff. In your experience, is anyone using data like this? So away from the food outbreak and the recall situation, and more towards developing an environmental monitoring program, right? FDA comes in and does a swabathon. They pick up a strain that they picked up last July, and they say you got unsanitary conditions. Could you see this data being used by industry to paint a different picture, to present a case that, no, we actually don't see the same strain, in our environment, persistence in our environment. You actually use whole genome sequencing data in defense of your program.
Yeah, so I think there are incredible opportunities. I think there are incredible opportunities that are probably resting just on the horizon. As a lawyer, I cut my teeth in the late 1990s as PulseNet was first coming online. And we saw there were lots and lots of outbreaks associated with ground beef. And I defended a lot of national ground beef producers throughout the United States. And that was the time when we called PFGE the gold standard. It was cool stuff. Like, for the first time ever, we were able to make these correlations between these two isolates, food and people, and think, wow, we've got a match. They're indistinguishable. And the regulators relied on that, right, to force recalls, right, to find those associations between people and products. And the plaintiffs' lawyers, Bill Marler, and I can't tell you how many experts, right, that we deposed who talked about the gold standard, our ability to finally make these correlations. But what we learned relatively quickly is some of those correlations were false. What appeared to be, matched by PFGE wasn't, because we started moving to MLDA, and those associations we saw weren't really associations. And we discovered that there was a lot more to learn. But what happened was some companies were falsely accused of causing illness, right? Going way back, Whitewater was a big example. So as we move forward and the science has developed, we're getting to a place where what we see is real. It's the real deal, and these mistakes and these false correlations aren't going to be made anymore. So from the efficacy of our food safety plan, I'd much rather be in a circumstance now that FDA is swabbing in the facilities where if they believe that an isolate correlates, right, that we have this association, a human to a food or not, right? I want that resolution to be as high as possible because it can establish that my food safety plan works. Additionally, if I'm producing product and there's a pathogen found up in my drain, right? And if it doesn't match human illness, guess what? That just proved, right, the efficacy of my food safety plan, probably. I mean, there may be low levels that are getting out, but it gives me the ability to argue to the agency or even the plaintiff's lawyer that our food safety plan is working. Right?
If it's okay if I jump in a little bit too.
Please do.
FDA also, to kind of piggyback what Sean just mentioned, is that, FDA does expect that, food industry is going to find foodborne pathogens during environmental sampling from time to time, right? Food is not sterile. We're not manufacturing food in kind of a hospital-like condition. So, FDA's, policies do reflect that, a robust environmental monitoring program where industry is hoping to search and destroy or to find the foodborne pathogens in the the low levels when they are in zones 4 and 3, even occasional 2, is a much better outcome for all of us than when FDA comes in, or unfortunately if the food is found to be positive as well. So FDA's, and that goes back into kind of our new regulations through the preventive control rules, that a ready-to-eat food manufacturer should have a robust environmental monitoring program. And the findings of a positive in the environment from time to time is not going to necessarily drive the large-scale recalls that are being talked about. It really is all about the data for both industry and the data for the regulatory agencies as well. If we come in and, if FDA conducts one of our famous swabathons that we've heard about, and unfortunately we do find positives from time to time, that it really is about what the industry's data is as well. Having a robust environmental monitoring program means it's a two-way conversation. It means that FDA can present the data that we had, but it's also about industry being able to prevent the signals that you guys have had as well, and what corrective actions you've done to help mitigate those environmental monitoring programs from finding it in a zone 1 or a food contact surface, or finding product positives. So it really, whole genome sequencing is really driving a lot of the signals, it's driving the conversations, and it really is about openness and transparency in both directions, both from FDA to industry and vice versa.
I think it's the vice versa that we're going to get into here in a bit, exactly how that would work in application. Joe, moving on to you. In your experience, do you believe most food safety professionals in the industry are aware of how the data is collected, how it's used on the FDA, USDA side?
I would think in general, in today's world, most food microbiologists and food safety folks, do have an understanding how the information is being collected and how it's being used. Again, this really is not that different from 20 years ago when FoodNet, PulseNet first kind of came along. So people kind of understand the model. Whether or not they understand all of the technical ins and outs, and whether or not they understand, how many step differences is important. That's kind of where I think there's a lot of misunderstanding so far, or still at this point. I was just going to jump back to your last question for a second. Because the question was around how can you use this to design a program, to design the right program. We talk a lot about ready-to-eat facilities. There's a lot of not ready-to-eat frozen facilities out there who probably do some environmental monitoring, probably need some help trying to understand if they get the right program in place. I'll dig back, 20 years maybe, but we used to have a company that made frozen pizzas, and definitely not ready-to-eat product. Contains, a raw dough, contains fresh vegetables in some instances, but we really were pushing at the time to have some type of an environmental program in place. The question was, when do you sample in that kind of a facility? The argument was that sampling during operations wasn't meaningful because you're probably bringing it in to the environment on not a daily basis, but somewhat frequent basis with some of these not ready-to-eat components like, let's say, fresh green peppers. So how could you use this data to show whether or not you occasionally brought it in or it actually had established itself in the environment? That was one where at the time we could use PFG to show that. So that program, the smartest or the best choice for that environmental program was to ensure that we were clean at pre-op. That whatever we might occasionally bring into that not ready-to-eat environment, every day when we cleaned, we could get it back out. If we started to see matches, that told us we maybe had something starting to establish itself in the environment. Now, if we saw different things all the time, again, you had to make a choice. Do I stop bringing in fresh green peppers? Do I work with my fresh green pepper supplier to keep driving down the incidence? You got some different avenues you can pursue there. But, that's an example of how you can use the technology to design the right program to improve the safety of your product, whether it's ready to eat or not ready to eat. Getting that extra level of discrimination might help me understand rather than, well, I got a bunch of lists here, I can't really tell where it's coming from, they all seem to come up with the same answer.
Thank you, Jeff. And do you have any ideas on what more can be done? I mean, there are no doubt, I mean, even though strain typing's been being done for a long time, there's always been companies who are reluctant to do strain typing because of the concerns of, you know, am I painting an unnecessarily poor picture that could be used against me later? Am I generating data that is going to serve as, you know, rope to hang myself with later? You know, in your opinion, what could be done to help the food industry understand the role of molecular strain typing and how it can be used to build a stronger food safety program?
So, you know, at the end of the day, you know, there's always talk about sharing cultures. You know, that, quite honestly, that's gonna always be a little bit of a pipe dream. There will maybe be some instances and examples where that can happen. But, you know, for industry to have the ability to use the technology, to have the ability to build some of their own libraries for their own facilities, to understand, you know, if they're seeing something, you know, repeat over time, or if they're seeing new things over time, you know, that's kind of where people can leverage the tool the most, if they can get the capability to have access to some of their own libraries, and that's when people will, you know, maybe be more willing to use the tool. You know, that said, it's always going to be a little bit of a reluctance because, you know, there's always that possibility that, you know, people used to have huge culture collections. I can remember having very huge culture collections at one time, and having our lawyers come in and say, "You've got how many? What?" You know, it's always a little bit of a balance there. You know, so understanding what you can do. The difference with, you know, with whole genome sequencing is, quite honestly, once I have the sequence, I don't need the culture anymore. So that's a little scary because somebody, you know, theoretically may come in and try and get your database and your data. So that's a hurdle people have to get behind. You know, one of the other hurdles is just, again, understanding how many SNP differences really is kind of a cutoff. You know, I think over the last 10 years as this technology started to get to be used more, you know, I can remember people saying, well, it's, you know, 0 to 5. No, 5 to 10. No, wait, depending on the strain, it might be 20 to 25. You know, that kind of unknown, that's what makes it difficult for industry, because we got to sell senior management on it, you know. So for us to convince them, to convince our lawyers, you know, when it's kind of still a moving target, it's a little bit tough. So there will always be that hesitation, but, you know, I think we'll get there eventually, and people will use it eventually. And we're just kind of getting through some of those growing pains.
Okay, and then we talked about correlation earlier, at least. Sean had brought up using strain typing in general, but whole genome sequencing more definitively to establish correlation between events, whether it's an environmental monitoring program or when there's an outbreak. Renato, in your opinion, does whole genome sequencing and next genome sequencing data have a role to play in determining the difference between causation and correlation, or is it all just correlation? In other words, can we use it to actually determine that there was an environmental positive in a plant in 2010, there was an outbreak in 2011, and one begat the other? Or is the correlation just telling us that this strain happened to be in this place in 2010 and happened to be in this food product in 2011?
It's a tough question. I would say we still need epidemiological data to assess whether there is causation. We can definitely say that there is a correlation, right, if they match. But to go further and say that there is a causation, we need epidemiological data. And one thing that we can do with whole genome sequencing that we couldn't do with PFG is actually build phylogenetic trees to see the evolution of the isolates, which may help you assess whether the original isolate was in the environmental isolate that gave rise to the one that was found 1 year later in a final product or in a clinical situation. But still, I think the epidemiological data still play a major role in that.
And I think, Leslie, that's what you were getting at before earlier, is that you can't rely on whole genome sequencing alone to drive policy decision because you need that additional data to try and suss out the difference between causation and correlation.
Right. I mean, it still is the exact same conversation that we've kind of always had is, you know, kind of where did this listeria come from, or how long has this salmonella been in the environment. What FDA's kind of policy and what we're saying, if unfortunately FDA does go in and do environmental sampling, or if we have a finished product sample that isolated LM or salmonella, and unfortunately there is a clinical isolate that is a very close match in the whole genome sequencing database. I mean, right then FDA is only able to say that the same strain was found in the product or in the environment that was found in the clinical isolate. We're not saying that that plant or that product caused that illness. FDA, works with CDC and with our local and state partners. There's still 3 legs to sort of the outbreak investigation tool, right? There's still the epi, the traceback, and sort of the investigation part. And all 3 are still equally as valuable. They still, serve a wide role. What FDA is able to do with our colleagues in CDC is to, still have that better honing device, right? We're able to kind of maybe have a better starting point. FDA and CDC have had a number of pretty cool success stories lately where, while unfortunately whole genome sequencing does give us a better tool to possibly implicate a product, it also gives us a better tool to rule people out. We've had a couple of outbreak situations lately where, the epi and the traceback led to a number of different companies. We had, a cheese outbreak where the case patients all claimed that they ate a variety of cheeses. CDC was not able to implicate a particular product. FDA was not able to implicate a particular firm. By using whole genome sequencing, FDA went out and did environmental sampling, and we conducted, sampling at retail in conjunction with our state and local counterparts. 2 of the firms that have really strong epi, our swabbing and our sampling were all negative. When we went to the 3rd location, the whole genome sequencing of that environmental sampling matched the outbreak strain. So by using kind of all of our tools, in conjunction, just like we have previously with PFGE or with other things, but as a better honing device, we're better able to, make sure that the right firm or the right product, may not present, further risk to consumers. So there's a wide variety, but we still, 100%, we still do need epi and traceback for outbreak investigations.
So, I'm really glad to hear that, that the agency internally is very aware of the alleys we might go down that we made a wrong turn, right? And that is now part of the discussion and it's actively being, it's being worked out. As a lawyer and a human being, I can tell you, still unfortunately, in some cases, and I think what we all have to be cautious about as we move forward and we continue, whole genome sequencing is used more often, it's used more frequently, there's more firms that are being, FDA is coming in and doing a swabathon, and we have suddenly more and more data. I think that from a human standpoint, psychologically, the presumption immediately, same goes with juries and probably everybody in this room, well, if there's an illness a year ago and now we're finding it in this facility, there's a good chance, at least it's that facility. That's where we're gonna start, right? And it could have come in on the onions that were supplied a week earlier, and those onions went to 100 other facilities, and something else accounts for it, but it takes a lot of work to get there. The problem is, in the meantime, the company that is at least tentatively, right, implicated, what do you do? And, you're kind of in a tough position as far as what decisions you make, are you implicated, are you not? So I think there's potential landmines. And the other danger that exists, and I've seen cases where defending food companies in outbreak litigation, once we have that first corollary, where that we believe there's a correlation, and the state and local health departments, everybody's talking and their hypothesis is it's company A, when they go back and re-interview case patients, sometimes there's some suggestion that you shopped at this grocery store, you bought these products, or did you, right? So there's a little bit of bias begins to work in, and you may have case patients on the epi side saying, yeah, I think you're right, I might have purchased that product, and now they're looped in, when in fact it might have been a different source altogether. So these are all things I think we need to be very careful about as we move forward.
I just would add, again, as we're kind of building data, learning, getting the databases more populated. I always say, are there the Smiths and the Joneses out there when it comes to the isolates? Are there going to be some genotypes that are going to be, fairly consistent? And, just happens to be you can find them in a number of plants or in a number of different raw materials. And, how do we get to that point, or will we get to that point where we start to see the Smiths and the Joneses? And, we got to be a little careful we don't make some mistakes until we get to that point. I could be wrong, maybe there are any Smiths and Joneses out there, but I kind of find it hard to believe that there are.
Yeah, and just to reiterate kind of the FDA perspective a little bit, is that kind of what Sean and Joe just mentioned, that is all about the conversation, right? That, FDA isn't going to come in and, there's a conversation if we have a positive sample. That is not a, what you need to do next conversation. We let you know that there's a positive. We also let you know, once we have whole genome sequencing results, and just as a conversation, like, here's our results, like, we will get back to you, or let us know if you have any corrective actions, or a way to kind of start the conversation to flow both ways, right? If a Purdue processor has environmental sampling data to show that, we've swabbed, 50 times this month and we've never isolated that strain, that's a different conversation than, if there isn't an environmental sampling program at all, or if you have isolated that outbreak strain, but decided to never swab again, right? And there's a different conversation, and I think by FDA, whether it's FDA that finds a positive, or whether it's your company, or whether it's another means, it's all about the conversation, and it really is all about what happens next in that production environment. What corrective actions are taken, what you decide to do, whether it's a supplier control issue or whether it's taking a look at your own manufacturing equipment. All of this is just a conversation, and it's it's a conversation that needs to happen both ways.
Thank you, Leslie. And so now we're gonna turn the conversation from the utility of whole genome sequencing on the regulatory side to what utility it may have on the industry side. So to start, Joe, what do you think are the biggest hurdles right now that must be overcome for the industry to really tap into the utility of whole genome sequencing technologies or strain type technology in general?
So, I'll kind of repeat what I already said. I think some of it is, we need to get a little better definition around the gray and how many steps and some of that information, because, it's difficult for us to sell to senior management when it seems like it's a moving target. Some of the biggest ways or easiest ways for us to get over the hurdles of using the technology are going to obviously be not to focus on pathogens. To look at where we can use the same technology to solve, spoilage issues that we've had that either keep coming back or we haven't been able to solve. Look at some things like that. Look at it from a little bit beyond whole genome sequencing, but metagenomics. Sometimes we have product defects, and because either of the age of the sample or what happened in the processing, you're never able to isolate something from that product to grow it out to see what it is. And theoretically, with metagenomics, you should be able to pull out some information that would give you some starting points and some digging points for some of that kind of stuff. And usually those situations are, somewhat unique, and so you typically only have one or two samples to dig into. So if we can, use the right tool right up front, there's some ways to start to build successes and sell people on the technology.
Right. So you think that's the best point of entry, something that's a little bit lower in terms of liability and risk.
Yeah, a little less scary.
Yeah. Okay, and then Leslie, assuming you agree that technology holds value for the industry, do you believe the FDA has a role to play in encouraging the industry to continue to consider the value of strain typing technologies for the improvement of their safety plans?
Sure, and I think this goes back to sort of, it might be my whole theme tonight, is the openness and transparency and all of us collaborating together. There has been a number of situations where, we've worked with industry, whether there was a previous recall or whether there was a previous outbreak situation. Industry in a number of situations has sent, FDA their isolates. for us to conduct whole genome sequencing as part of sort of a collaboration to see kind of what's going on. And as the firm has, maybe suspended operations on one of their production lines, we've shared kind of the whole genome sequencing results we've had, and then companies have, asked us to sequence their isolates to better understand what corrective actions they may need to take. Definitely not punitive, and sort of more of a collaboration kind of thing, and all of us working together to ensure public health.
Sean? So, hypothetically speaking, I'm a food manufacturer, and I just had a positive result in my environment. Send it to the FDA, have them sequence it, and tell me what it's all about, or sit on that one?
Well, okay, so it's fraught with, you have to very carefully navigate that minefield. When we talk about, here's the problem. If I'm a food company, right, and I'm manufacturing a product, and that's going out into commerce, and there is a positive sample from the environment, and I conduct WGS on that, and I compare it to the database, and I find out that it's associated with human illness, right? I'm in that circumstance where that we had talked about, where a big investigation is triggered, and it may be determined, right, that my food product caused that illness. Now, from a human health standpoint, that's really good, right? It's good for the consuming public because we identified a product that's likely causing illness, right? But from the company standpoint, you can now imagine, or you can understand why companies would be very reluctant to do that. So there's been discussions about companies, perhaps on their own, right, doing using whole genome sequencing, comparing the results against the database to see if it's a match to a particular commodity or some other sample that was collected in the past, but what if it matches human illnesses? And now I, as a company, am aware of that, right? And I'm sitting on that information. And I think, well, it's probably not my company, it's that onion supplier that sent the stuff to all those other companies. And let's say there are 3 illnesses, right? But then 6 months later, FDA comes in, conducts a swabathon within the facility, finds Listeria in my drain, compares it against the PulseNet or the genome tracker, and now instead of 3 illnesses, there's 18, right? And it was my facility. And now DOJ may get involved, and somebody might go to jail. So I think moving forward, there's incredible opportunity to use it as a tool to improve the food safety plan, but industry and FDA have to work together to give industry some type of cover. Maybe we don't look at human isolates, or we don't see if it's associated with any human illness. Maybe we just look at certain data sets. Maybe we create some kind of immunities for companies that are willing to do it, because they're leaning forward in the food safety foxhole. They want to know, right? That's a good company, oriented the right way, but that one decision to do the right thing the company could be gone, right? It doesn't exist anymore because of what we found. So I think there is incredible opportunity to work together, but we have to create sort of a safe harbor, I think, for industry to actually go out and embrace it fully.
And I think kind of my target point with what Sean just mentioned is that the company then sat on it, right? That the company A conducted whole genome sequencing and realized that they had this potential situation going on and sat on it. It really is I can't stress it enough, it really is all about what corrective actions happen once you find out. Just because you found, Listeria in a drain or in your food production environment, that does not mean that, the FDA is coming with a hammer. It really is all about the conversation. It really is, we want the companies to, do the right thing and to take the robust corrective actions to, seek and destroy, to eliminate, LM from definitely zone 1s and as much out of the production environment as possible. So by conducting whole genome sequencing and realizing that, there is a potential situation, that's another, signal to start a conversation with us. And the conversation does go both ways.
Okay, so we at Cornell collaborate with a lot of food industry, and just like an example, we know that some big companies, they don't go online with their WGS data. They don't blast their sequence on NCBI. They don't even download sequence from NCBI to compare against their database, because they they are afraid that if they download something from NCBI and they compare it as their own isolate, if they find a match, what do? They don't want to have that moral responsibility of having to do something, so they don't even reach out to this sequence that genome tracker uploads.
So they can keep their data in quarantine, essentially. Then they only use it to compare against their data set. They don't compare
Complete
it against other
firewall,
data
no connection to the outside world. It's
And-
all internal.
sets. And Sean, I assume that sounds like a reasonable approach if it's a company that's looking to do their own string typing, but they don't want to get into the messy, issue of well, what happens if it pops up in somebody else's library and there's implications with it.
Yeah, of course, and even how you do it. There's a very strong, so the question becomes, what information, and I really want to be careful here because I think everybody in this group would agree from a public health standpoint, it makes sense for companies to share as much data as possible, be as transparent as possible. We can figure out where there's problems and issues, they can be solved, right? And the food supply will be safer. But from a practical, a business, a legal, all of these intricacies that get involved, it becomes very, very complex and very difficult. And that's, I think, what we're trying to navigate. The use of the data, just internally in a black box, I think is incredibly helpful because now I can have a very clear picture of what's in my facility as a resident, as a transient. I can test my incoming ingredients, and I can do all these different things, right, to use that. Now that creates other legal issues if I begin going down that road, but I think more visibility is what we're going to see in the future as we go forward. Putting our head in the sand is not working, right? And it's not going to work moving forward. It just will not. We have to open our eyes, right? Turn on all the lights and see as much as we can. So I believe that moving forward, that's where we're going. And we're going to have to use this stuff for that purpose.
Well, whole genome sequencing, it's strain typing in general, it's voluntary, right? That's not necessarily implicit in the definition of a robust environmental monitoring program. No doubt it makes it more robust. But because it's voluntary, right, then people have to be motivated and comfortable and feel like what they're spending resources on. It costs money too, right? It's not isn't free. It's getting cheaper. But it still costs money, and so people have to be motivated to use it. In order to be motivated to use it, they must be comfortable in using it. So there has to be a system of doing the bioinformatics on that end of it that's closed and that doesn't lead to other applications. I mean, one example is if you had the ability to put a wire into your car that would have a constant reading of your odometer. Or speedometer, your speedometer. Would you be okay with that being linked up to your local law enforcement? I mean, do you want them to get live data on your speedometer? Probably not. Now, if you could do that and then take the data and then go home and look at it and kind of laugh to yourself and like I could be better than that. But that's for your own use, right?
Right.
So and that's essentially the difference is can you generate this data and use it for your own use and make yourself a better driver, or a better food safety, build a better food safety program, or are you generating data that's going to get in trouble? And I think that's the question that needs to be answered. I think that's really the first gate that needs to be cleared in order to open the door to industry using this technology for themselves.
Yep, I agree. And there's ways to do it. What do the regulations require us to do? They require us to have a food safety plan, ready to eat products. We have to have an environmental monitoring plan. And what does the agency get to look at, right? Any records that are generated is a result of having that plan that federal law requires us to have, because they have to verify that we have a plan and that we're actually following it. But there is a very strong argument to make that if I have a separate program that's not required by law, or I want to do a study, just a sort of extracurricular study, nothing to do with any of my written food safety plans. I'm going to do some testing. I'm going to stay away from food contact surfaces. I'm going to stay away from food products, anything that would put me in a regulatory stance if I got a positive, right? And I can tickle out some data and I can do that separately, right? FDA, per se, doesn't get access to that, right? Unless it can establish under other authority that it needs those documents in order to determine whether the use or consumption of a product is leading to, is causing adverse health consequences or death. There's ways to filter it, right, through the use of lawyers, different strategies, creative strategies that can be used to get some of that information and better protect it.
Does that work? And there's lots of, I know there's companies that use that. They use the legal firewall to submit it to the attorney then submits the data to them, and then so they can invoke attorney-client privilege. Does that work? Has that been tested yet?
It's going to depend on the circumstance and the judge. So in the FDA world, if truly a study is being conducted, data is being generated, you really can't make a correlation between a direct food safety issue or human illness or death and the data that's been generated. It's been run through the lawyers that are involved. They're engaging the lab company. There's some very strong firewalls. In the Army, we called it cover, or I'm sorry, concealment when we're behind a bush, but it's cover when we're behind a rock, right? So, there's arguments the agency could make to issue a subpoena to try to get that information. A judge would also ultimately have to make a determination whether that in fact is protected. It's a long process, but I think those companies that are doing those things and trying to collect that data are using it to improve their food safety programs. They'll probably never find themselves in a circumstance where they're looking down the barrel of a subpoena from the agency.
So just, I guess one point I'll make too that goes along with a lot of that as well is, you have to look at you still have to look at timing on this kind of information. And again, quite honestly, it ends up being historical information you go back to look at. In the best Listeria environmental program, what you do is, again, you're testing for Listeria species, you're not testing specifically for LM, you're casting a wide net, you're taking a conservative approach. You want to try and see the indicators that might point to something in your environmental controls or your other programs isn't working quite the way it should. You need to be, hopefully, you're taking action as soon as you get that positive result. You're not waiting for speciation, you're definitely not waiting to get an isolate, then send it along somewhere else. Figure out with your procurement people if you want a PO this week or not to get the whole genome sequencing done. Again, quite literally, it might be a month or two before you actually get that information. So if you're doing everything and reacting the way that you should when you get that first positive, you might feel more comfortable again down the road about trying to build some understanding of, the history of what you might find in a given environment or in a given facility. But, it's if you are taking the approach of, well, I got a positive, I'm going to, kind of not do any more sampling till I get a chance to get a sequence and find out if it made somebody sick, that's the wrong approach to start with. You're already going down the wrong path. So kind of as Sean is saying, as Leslie said too, it kind of depends on, what are you doing about it? What did you do when you first got that Listeria species positive? Do you have an aggressive program? Do you dig deep? Do you go after it? Many times if you've got a great program, you're never going to get that second one. And then again, it becomes a little bit more of a historical. You might find out, that, geez, in this one area, now over the last year, I've had 3 hits. Maybe then I want to know if I'm not digging deep enough and I haven't found something. Now, I would argue, I can do that with PFG or a lot of other tools. I don't have to do whole genome sequencing. But, again, there's a lot of other side benefits to whole genome sequencing, that go beyond even the regulatory reaction or link it up to the illness cases when you start to think about how you could use that information down the road.
Okay, thank you, Joe. And then Renato, if a company was looking to get into whole genome sequencing, next genome sequencing, they want to have a molecular laboratory where they can do not just whole genome sequencing, but all the other different bioinformatic applications that they can be derived from it, foliage investigations, authenticity analysis, microbiome analysis, probiotic stability, you name it. What does that setup cost? What does it look like to build a whole genome next-gen sequencing laboratory?
Right, so assuming they already have the microbiologists, right, and they are doing already sampling and things like that, they just need to set up the sequencing part. So it requires the sequencing instrument. If they want to do in-house, they will need to buy a sequencing instrument. So MySeq, or probably if it's a small scale, would be something like MySeq, for example. They need reagents, and then the reagents will depend on how many samples they will be able to do per month, or the more you buy, the cheaper you can get them. But it all depends on the how many use you have for that machine. In terms of having a bioinformatician to analyze the data, if it's just whole genome sequencing, it might not be required. Today we have some user-friendly programs that can be used to do the whole SNP analysis and give you the results. So maybe it's better to have somebody who can interpret a phylogenetic tree and interpret the difference in SNPs or alleles than actually having a bioinformatician for that. And most of the food industries, I believe, will have someone, and the food microbiologist would be someone with that expertise. So the cost would be high. I cannot it depends on the machine, on how many samples you want to do. But the more you use, the cheaper it will get. So if you want to do whole genome sequencing and metagenomics, and have other applications, if you want to do research, it might be something more valuable. If you are just looking for source tracking, you're going to do like one sample per month, then you're better off hiring a service and doing this outside.
Okay, thank you, Renato. And we are just about ready for the audience questions. So, Joy, I know you're going to have someone walk around with
Yvonne's out there.
Oh, very good. Okay.
Oh, no, you have the mic.
I do.
I was gonna be a little bit of a smart aleck while you were changing there, saying, hey, you know, where's my Siri at? Hey Siri, can you analyze the sequence for me?
One day, I don't think we're far from that, Joe.
Thank you. And thanks very much for the panel. I have a 2-hour drive to get back and forth, and this was well worth it. So I really appreciate it, and it was very informative. My name is Greg Saragusa, and I work for European Genomics. And I'm going to make a comment and then have a question. The comment is that if anyone is attending the IAFP meeting this year, we have a workshop that is entitled Genomics 101 for the food industry. And it starts at a very low level, and it works its way up during the course of the day to a higher level. And we're going to focus mainly on terminology. So that's the comment. The question is, it could be for Dr. Orsi or if anyone knows, please. It's about being able to resolve Salmonella enteritidis. Salmonella enteritidis is very clonal and it's difficult to resolve. Has WGS helped that?
Yes, WGS has a much greater discriminatory power over PFG or MLVA for Salmonella enteritidis. So, going back to the concept of number of SNPs that you need to say that something is the same thing or if it's different. So for Salmonella enteritidis, maybe your threshold will be lower. For another pathogen, maybe 10 SNPs you would consider to be the same thing. Maybe for enteritidis, 10 SNPs is enough to say that they are different. It depends also on the food chain that you analyze. Environments that allow for rapid growth of Salmonella, you would expect more SNPs. In like food environment where you would expect like slower growth of the pathogen, you might be happy with less SNPs difference to actually call them the same. But enteritidis, as you said, is very clonal, so it's one of these pathogens that is really hard to do outbreak surveillance and source tracking because of this great relatedness of all the isolates. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that.
I mean, I know just that FDA has been looking at, we do have isolates in the database for Salmonella enteritidis, both environmental and product sampling as well. And we have seen, you know, that there is a pretty great degree of separation once you kind of look at some of the supply chain issues. So that is one of the great successes that we're seeing with whole genome sequencing is Salmonella enteritidis and other species are being able to be much greaterly separated. We're seeing a lot of great separation out with El Mono as well. I mean, I don't think we're too far away from saying that maybe not all El Mono may cause illness. I think that's a great academic question that's beyond my scope at FDA, but I mean, I think whole genome sequencing is giving us a lot of pretty cool tools, a lot of different applications than, kind of just on the regulatory side.
I just want to comment on the L model, because that's my favorite pathogen, and I study L model for several years. So there are some hypovirulent isolates of L model. They have premature stop codons in some virulence genes, and they do show lower virulence. And they are more often isolated from foods and food environments than the hypervirulent or the fully virulent isolates. So, yeah, just a thought.
Any other questions?
Joe, what's your favorite pathogen?
Mine is El Mono.
Oh, wow. That's 2 for 2. Sean, do you have a favorite?
Oh boy.
They're all so great in their own way.
Yeah, I kind of like E. coli 015787, I guess the family, only because it was everywhere, 15 years ago, at least at beef facilities, and we've done a really good job of sort of chasing it away. So, it's a victory in my book.
But Leslie, I don't mean to ignore you, but I assume you're not allowed to comment on your pathogen. Is that beyond the pale?
Yeah, anyone that we don't find is a good one.
Great answer.
No, I mean, I agree with everyone what they said. I mean, I think that all of us are, both industry and academia and regulatory, we're all kind of looking at this in similar ways, just maybe with a different focus. So I think it's a pretty cool technology, and we'll see a lot of great things come out of it.
So I'm going to start this question with Joe and see where it goes from there. Imagine we extrapolate this technology to real-time detection. Joe, what does that do to your food safety programs? And what's the regulatory implication of knowing things immediately?
So anything real time is always nice from the perspective of, whether or not I'm holding a product or being able to take action more quickly. Again, I guess the one thing I would say is, fundamentally, if I can get L species, that level of discrimination in real time, I can do everything I need to do. And I can have a better program for it. But, to be able to get further strain differentiation and be able to get that additional information, you could do some really good things with it. But again, it's also kind of that catch-22. Now, what do I need to do with that information? What am I, really obligated to do with that information?
So it all goes back to the corrective actions, right? It goes back to when you found it, where you found it, and what you did next. And with a huge focus on what you did next, right? If you know that, a production environment, you may have a resident strain of El Mono and you detected it and, you're taking corrective actions. I mean, the sooner you can take corrective actions, the less product that may be implicated, right? I mean, it really is all about, what you did next and, to hopes that, the resident strain will be eliminated or you're able to detect the transient strains before they get to, possibly a zone 1 or a product contamination as well. So just going back to, when you knew it and what you did about it is the regulatory part.
I guess I would ask, how far are we from that day? Is that something we're going to see in the very short term, or is it years out? When it happens, it will change the world. It will change the food industry. It will change everything. To have results, down to the, if we're looking for LM or one of the strains of concern, E. coli strains of concern, or Salmonella, almost instantly. Wow, it creates incredible incentive to test, decrease size of batches, test every one, turn that product quick. It would be stunning, in my view.
I believe that's the trend for the sequencing industry, they are trying to get it quicker and smaller. So something that you can take to the field and do the sequencing whenever you are, wherever you are. And that you can imagine like going to a farm and taking samples from lettuce and doing whole genome sequencing right there and sending the data to your company in Chicago and say, hey, here's the data, compare with our isolates that you got there. And then, okay, it matches. So you are already in the farm, you can then take action right there. So that's probably where the industries of the sequencing industry, the instruments are going, like the Minaions and things like that. So getting smaller and quicker.
Any other questions?
This is directed to Leslie. I know with the advent of FSMA and moving towards a risk preventative control type model, a lot of food manufacturers right now, the hardest part, if they don't have people on their staff with a passive background in order to figure out how they assess their risks. I know there's training, there's classes, but there's so many variability between one session to the next. How open is the FDA in terms of people reaching out to try to find out? Because guidance documents are written in legalese, which you have to spend a lot of time to understand, decipher how you're able to read that. What is FDA doing to try and bridge that gap to go from the policy to the implementation from
Sure, and that's probably $1 million question. It's a great question. FDA has a number of, ways that you could reach out to contact us. I mean, we don't mind at all, and we get questions probably all day long. So, I mean, we're here not just as regulators, but to, kind of help as well. There is the more formal route probably would be through FSMA. There's the Technical Assistant Network, or the TAN. That's both for the regulatory side and for industry. So there's a way to, on the FDA.gov website, there's a way to submit a question for, FSMA questions and that kind of stuff that gets funneled to the appropriate people for within the agency, whether it's our scientific experts or whether it's more of a compliance question or a field question. They get tracked and they get funneled to the appropriate people. If you have difficulty finding some of those resources, feel free to reach out to myself. My email address I think is in somewhere. But it's my first name dot my last name at fda.hhs.gov. I'm happy to help. I can't promise I know the answer, but I can try to get one for you.
One other thing I would suggest is, there's a lot to be said for the phone a friend. There's a lot of people in this room that can help. There's a lot of folks at iFish. There's a lot of folks at your university extensions. There are a lot of great sources out there to help people work through some of those risk assessment questions if they need some help.
Any other questions?
There's another question. Okay.
Irina Sikortseva with Mastery with Confectionery. You probably, and this question to all panelists, you probably heard about recent recall of dairy powder in France, from one of the dairy manufacturers in France. And the recall bacteria that was associated with that recall product is Salmonella Angora. And manufacturer made a connection to another outbreak that took place about 12 years ago in 2005 to the same Salmonella Angora species. So my question to your panelists, do you know what tool was used, PFG or whole genome sequence, to identify that Salmonella Angora? And if the second part of the question, if we hypothetically assume that PFG was used and a according to Ben, that about 50% of Salmonella strains cannot be truly identified or speciated with PFG. Can it be hypothetically say that that connection is false?
Sure. So I'll start, and others feel free to jump on in. So FDA, with CDC and USDA, we primarily started using whole genome sequencing in about 2014. So it's been a relatively new technology. So if the situation that you're discussing was, earlier than that, it would have been, using other molecular typing technologies like PFGE. I'm not, super familiar with that exact situation. So kind of in general, we've seen both, if it's a match or if it's indistinguishable from PFGE, we've seen it go both ways using whole genome sequencing, right? The technology and the scientific perspective of whole genome sequencing is that it's a larger signal, right? It's stronger. You're able to identify nucleotide differences versus PFGE that you're kind of shaping based on size, and you're taking sort of bands out of the whole genome. So we've seen that if two strains are indistinguishable from PFGE, we've seen that they either, we've seen both, that it could be, a genetic match or it's highly related using whole genome sequencing, but we've also seen that, it's not related at all through whole genome sequencing, just kind of depending on the different situation. So I guess from our perspective, just because it was two strains were indistinguishable using PFGE does not mean that they are a match using whole genome sequencing that FDA would need to run, or that whole genome sequencing would need to be run to be able to describe that exact situation.
But we can go backwards, right? So if you have the isolate from 12 years ago in a cryogenic freezer, right, and it wasn't run by whole genome sequencing 12 years ago, but we still have the isolate, and if we wanted to, you could run it today, compare it to a new isolate from today, determine if that isolate from 12 years ago was in fact exactly the same. And I guess that does beg the question, is that something that's being done? Is that a course of action in some cases?
Sure, and you all can appreciate that, with the federal government, we have limited resources and budget constraints and that kind of stuff. But FDA is, looking into, we're sequencing some of the isolates that we've had in our freezers, and, kind of just taking a look. There's nothing, it's just sort of like the signal device, right? We're just kind of building like the database up as a whole to kind of get the best match possible, in any given situation. That does not mean that FDA is going back into our freezers from 20 years ago and asking for recalls or anything like that, where it really is about building the database to be able to get the best match possible as new situations arise.
Any more questions?
So along the same lines with the extra differentiation that you're seeing with whole genome sequencing, I guess this is probably for Leslie and Dr. Orsi, but so you've got a whole and also you're to your point of how many SNPs is enough SNPs. The extra differentiation that you're seeing, is it making sense in your investigations that there's a correlation, logically from the extra differentiation you're seeing to phenotypic evidence, to serology evidence, to everything, chain of custody and all that, versus, is it just, does it make less sense a lot of the time than more sense? Or you know what I'm trying to get at? Is that the extra differentiation, is it just point mutations here and there, or is it really leading logically to Eureka, we know something now that we didn't know before?
Sure.
Versus other older technologies.
We've seen a lot of really interesting matches with whole genome sequencing. It hasn't lied to us yet. And I think that we're seeing sort of the SNP mutations, and we're seeing that kind of stuff. And when we kind of have a match in the database, so to speak, taking a look at where those samples came from, if they didn't come from the same plant, we're able to, make a story out of where that El Mono came from, kind of thing. We're seeing a lot of really cool stuff, and I guess my answer to your question is that it hasn't, lied to us yet, and that we're it really is a better mousetrap for us.
And we do have time for at least one more question. I think there was a question over here at the two.
Thank you, all of you again. It's been an extremely interesting discussion and debate. My question is more on the area of the recalls, and also earlier when you were discussing the frozen vegetables and some of the challenges that there are with what I call legacy facilities. And I realize that your testing methods and all of the new technology will make a wonderful difference in the future. AFI and a few of the other organizations are looking instead at validated RTE processing for some of the facilities versus a legacy IQF facility. Any opinions on going that direction?
Sure, and I think that comes down to, and I don't know if Sean wants to add anything about, that comes down to sort of the business risk. That, FDA wants to make sure that consumers, are as safe as possible, and that, the conditions and practices that food is being manufactured under, we want to make sure that, they don't contribute to, foodborne contamination. We've had discussions, and we've kind of seen, both kind of thought processes, as FDA inspections kind of arise. But I think that, as we learn more through whole genome sequencing, and as we're learning more through sampling some of these, traditionally not ready-to-eat products, but we're seeing that customers are using them in some situations in ready-to-eat ways. Such as, frozen peas, people are adding to, a casserole, or, they're not cooking, or, we're learning through whole genome sequencing about some unique, consumer patterns as well. Cake mixes being used in smoothies, and there's a lot of really, interesting things that whole genome sequencing is helping us to kind of uncover a bit. So I think that, the business risk of kind of how kind of, ready to eat you need to make that facility would kind of depend on not only the product, but the process and the consumer that it's going to.
Right, so there's been all sorts of products that have been recalled, and lots of debate about, well, should they have been recalled or not? Are they safe? Are they wholesome? Are they adulterated? How are they going to be used by the consumer? We're on the heels now of frozen biscuits being recalled because of Listeria monocytogenes concerns. So I think from my perspective, it's kind of like bumper bowling, right? The ball is kind of bouncing off the bumpers, and we're swinging a little bit one way, and then we're kind of moving the other way, and we're trying to figure out how we can get in the middle of the lane. It wasn't that long ago that there is all sorts of activity, right, focused on those legacy facilities, frozen IQF vegetables. And we've seen some, as we've learned, we've let, reason kind of enter, the discussion. We've seen some shifts. Mickey George, or Mickey Parrish, who was supposed to be here, was, recently reaching out to the IQF frozen vegetable producers and, getting their input as to like, how do we deal with some of these issues, right? And that's fabulous that those conversations are happening. I think they're going to continue to happen. I think we're going to continue to refine those policies, but I think it's going to be a little bit of, smoothness and then some surprises.
And I think that goes back to, the data that industry has as well, right? So I guess I'm putting a plug in that, it really is about, the collaboration part of it. It's about what corrective actions, industry is taking. It's about kind of knowing your consumer base. It's about knowing kind of the risk of that facility. It's about knowing, maybe the whole genome results, as you purchase a new plant. We're seeing kind of some unique things kind of pop up, and, FDA is, comparing, different strains that were in, the plant over time. So it's kind of a unique situation, and, frozen veggies is only one part of that.
Yeah, and I'd just add to that again, trying to stay aware of what what the consumer is doing, what the practices are. You know, it wasn't all that long ago where, you know, the definition of what's not ready to eat was, well, I put a cooking instruction on it, so it must be not ready to eat. And, you know, that's not the way it is. And there are, you know, legacy facilities that are, you know, have a lot of opportunity to improve and continue to try and get to, you know, better than, you know, purely not ready to eat, so I have a cooking instruction on it. But it's a journey.
All right, I think that's it for audience questions. Just a couple of closing questions for the group here. Renato, starting with you. Is next-gen sequencing the end game for sequencing, or is there more to come? Are we kind of at where, like, what do you do after you sequence a genome?
Okay, so next generation sequencing as the instrument, like the sequencing itself, is still evolving. So what we call next generation sequencing is actually something that has been evolving since for the last 20 years. Started with the 454 viral sequencing, and now we are at, like, we have PacBio, things that can sequence the whole genome at once. But we still call everything as next generation sequencing, but they are very different instruments. And this is still evolving, and maybe we're gonna call something different, maybe we're gonna still call it next generation sequencing. But it's something that is already changing and will continue to change.
So mostly just faster and less expensive?
Well, the trend seems to be that to get things quicker, the output quicker, and also more mobile. So,
but in terms of the data, like once you've sequenced all 3 million base pairs, you're kind of out of stuff to do with it?
Yeah, so for outbreak surveillance and source tracking, it seems that we have today we have two main approaches to analyze the data. One is looking at SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. These are the nucleotides in the genome. The other approach is to look at alleles, what we call multi-local sequence typing, but whole genome multi-local sequence typing.
So most of the evolution is going to be on the bioinformatics side, and it's going to get faster and cheaper on the instrumentation side, the analysis side, but it's bioinformatics that we're going to continue to, evolve.
Yeah, and it seems that we are moving towards the core genome MLST and whole genome MLST instead of high quality SNPs. So it seems that MLST is it's easy to approach. You don't need a reference genome to compare against. You can get the data faster and easier than with SNP analysis.
Very good. All right, and Joe, when you think 10 years out, do you think that next-gen sequencing, whole genome sequencing, will have as big a transformative impact on food testing as like PCR did some decades ago? Like, is it going to be that big in 10 years?
Yeah, I think it will. I think it's the next evolution. I think, a lot of stuff we didn't even touch on tonight. When you start to think about what can I do once I get all those sequences, I can start to really do some data mining, look for better sites to design rapid test kits around, look for better targets to prevent growth. Again, look at different ways to think about pathogenicity and virulence. Once we really start to get this bulk of data and information, there's a lot of things just beyond the outbreak investigation, that I think are really going to make it stick.
To the point where maybe conversation about whole genome sequencing is really just the tip of the iceberg. Like it's actually a smaller portion of how next-gen sequencing is going to be applied on the food industry side compared to, say, the regulatory side, where it is all about whole genome sequencing. On the food side, it's going to be more about microbiome analysis, exposure investigation.
Selection of probiotics, all sorts of strains, all sorts of different things.
Right. And then Leslie, on the FDA side, is it all genome tracker? I mean, is that the alpha and omega for next-gen sequencing over there, or are you guys looking at different applications for NGS outside of genome tracker?
Sure. FDA is doing constant research on this topic. It's active research. We, like what other members of the panel mentioned, we want things faster, stronger, more accurate. Kind of the better signal device. The sooner we know, the sooner we can protect the public, and the sooner we can let industry know the results that we have to maybe influence any corrective actions or any next steps that you guys would have as well. So FDA, while we're using whole genome sequencing right now, there is active research going on right now into some of these other pretty cool technologies as well.
Thank you. And then Sean, attorney, gets the last word. Any closing recommendations for our audience on how they should view or approach using this technology? Is it a friend? Is it a foe? Is it a frenemy?
All right, so closing arguments. I think it's a frenemy at this point. I think at some point in the future it will be a solid friend. From a public health standpoint, it's done amazing things. It will continue to do amazing things. From an industry standpoint, to echo Joe's comments, there are so many things that we will be able to do in the future once we start embracing, right, rather than shunning it, embracing this technology and finding ways to use it. I think in the near term, my only cautionary note would be when we take that first step, we just need to be really careful about how we're using it, in what ways we're employing it, right? And that we're using the data in a way that's effective, but we're also really kind of protecting ourselves. And until as these issues sort of get worked out, the conversation continues, and the agency and the industry gets to a point where we all kind of shake our head and say, yeah, this is cool. This is how we're going to do this going forward.
Thanks, Sean. All right, Renato, Sean, Leslie, Joe, thanks for joining us. Everyone, let's give a thank you to our panelists. And that concludes the panel. Thank you all.